Professor Scott Evans, thanks so much for coming on to Evolution Soup, all the way from your office in Florida State University. You are Assistant Professor at the Department of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences, Florida State University. Your main interests are centered on the biology and ecology of soft-bodied organisms from critical transitions in the history of life on Earth, focusing on the Ediacaran period over 500 million years ago. Welcome to the show, Scott. Today we'll be talking not only about the Ediacaran, but also a fascinating new discovery, a very important creature called Quaestio. And Quaestio has received quite the whirlwind of attention since the announcement. Isn't that right?
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks so much, Mark, for having me. Yeah, it's as scientists, we work long hours and convince ourselves that what we're doing is interesting and fun and exciting. But it's always great when we finally get to the stage where we can publish and share what we're finding with the world. And so it's been lovely to see the response to this new fossil that we described, Quaestio. And yeah, really, I think what people get is that, this thing is really weird. But they can also see in that question mark that gives it its name that it does have this distinction between left and right. And so that's something that we all have. Most of us, when we take notes, we do it with a specific hand. And that goes back to this very weird, very old creature that we just described.
Before we dive down deep into the Ediacaran depths, let's just hear a little bit about your background. Scott, where did you grow up, and what interests and fascinations led you to where you are now?
Yeah, so I grew up in New York State here in the US, but I didn't grow up. Most people, when they think of New York, they think of the city. I grew up about 3 hours north of the city in a very rural part of New York. And what was really cool is that growing up there, my driveway was actually lined with gravel. And from probably before I can remember, I was fascinated by what I was finding in the gravel. So there were these minerals called pyrite, which many people call fool's gold because it looks a lot like gold. It's just a lot more common and so not nearly as valuable. But I also was finding in this gravel in my driveway things like coral and brachiopods and snails. And it blew my mind, even as a young kid, to know that these are creatures from the ocean and they're found in my, inland part of the world in New York State. And not only that, but they're right outside my front door. So I always had a fossil collection growing up, but I wasn't really sure that you could be a paleontologist as an adult. So when I went to college, I enrolled as a math major, basically because I seemed to do well in math, and that seemed to be pretty rare. So I thought, oh, that's what I'll major in college. But I took a course in the history of life on Earth, and it took me right back to those days as a kid, walking around my driveway and collecting rocks. And I had a mentor, Dr. Jeff Over at Geneseo, which is a small state school where I did my undergrad, who told me, you can do this. You can be a paleontologist. And haven't really looked back since. And so once I started really doing this more seriously, one of the things that I realized was that I don't just want to find the things that everybody finds at a certain site. I want to know what's the rarest thing that can be found here, and I want to try and find that. And so that has led me to starting to think about the preservation and the amazing things we can learn about soft-bodied organisms in the geologic past. So most fossils that people probably think of, things like those corals and snails, or even things like dinosaur bones, those are bone or shell. And so those are what we call hard parts, and those are the most common types of fossils. But in very rare cases, we get perfect conditions where we don't just get the hard parts of those organisms, we also get the soft parts, or we get organisms that don't have bones or shell at all. And so I realized that's what I wanted to study. And that really took me back to very old rocks, a very, very distant part of Earth's past, where there are actually no organisms that make hard parts at all. So everything is soft-bodied, and everything is very rare. So from undergrad, I went to the University of California, Riverside, where I worked with Dr. Mary Drozer, working on some Ediacaran fossils from the outback of South Australia, where I continued to work. Went on to postdocs at the Smithsonian, the National Museum of Natural History with Dr. Doug Irwin, and then eventually to Virginia Tech with past EVOLUTIONSoup guest Shuhai Zhao. And yeah, continue to think about many of the topics we'll talk about today. What's going on in the Ediacaran and why is it important?
Scott, can you give us an overview of the Ediacaran period, when it took place, the kind of creatures we can find there, and the kind of work you do with Ediacaran fossils?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Ediacaran period took place between 635 and 538 million years ago. So about 100 million year period in Earth history. And I know that that term Ediacaran may not be familiar to most of you. That is actually just named for a place where we find really exceptional rocks from this period in Earth's history, the Ediacaran Hills of South Australia. And that's actually an important cultural site. And in fact, that word Ediacaran comes from Australian Aboriginal name from the Adnyamathanha people. This is a culturally important site to them, as well as a really important geologic site. And so that's where this term that I'll use a lot, Ediacaran period or the Ediacaran biota, comes from. So the Ediacaran is important because it's actually the time just before the Cambrian, which is one you maybe have heard of if you haven't heard of Ediacaran. And that's a time where we really start to see an explosion of animal life and really amazing fossils from around the world. But that's a time where we do have things with hard parts, like I mentioned before. The Ediacaran is important because this is a time where we see the precursors, in many cases, to those Cambrian organisms. So these are entirely soft-bodied, so they don't have shells yet. But what's really amazing is that this is actually the first time in all of Earth's history where you can go out and you can just flip over a rock, and without using a microscope or breaking that rock down into its chemical components, you can see just with your naked eye, hey, there's a fossil in here, and you know, it looks like something that was alive at one time. And so this is really where we're seeing the first large organisms, the first multicellular organisms, and in many cases, the first animals, right? That group of living things that we belong to, they began in the Ediacaran, or at least the first fossils we get of them come from this time period. So some of the fossils we find, many of them are very strange. So Dickinsonia is one that I actually did most of my PhD on. And so it is this amazingly weird organism. It's flat, sort of looked like a pancake or a dinner plate. And we know actually that it could move around on the seafloor, which is also important because these are the first animals that could actually move. And it probably did that to get at different food sources. And so moving in search of food is something I think many of us can relate to. And that began in this important period in the Ediacaran. So we've known about the Ediacaran for about 70 years. It was first discovered in the UK, in places like Charnwood Forest, as well as in Australia, where we get these amazing things like Dickinsonia and things like Quaestio that we'll talk about, by a geologist named Reg Sprague. And so over the last 70 years, we've learned a lot about this time period, including just how different it was from the Earth today and marine environments that we can visit today. And so that's been really exciting, because not just for learning about the beginnings of animal life, but also NASA funds our work and funds the work that I'm talking to you about today, because they want to know about these alien planets that existed in Earth's past, and the alien life forms like Quaestio and Dickinsonia that existed there.
In 2021 and 2022, you were a postdoctoral fellow under the advisement of Dr. Shuhai Zhao at Virginia Tech. Shuhai was a guest on EVOLUTIONSoup during that period and talked about the Cambrian as well as the so-called Cambrian explosion. Is there a link between the earlier Ediacaran period and the Cambrian? And do we know what happened in between?
Yeah, so initially, when the Ediacara biota was discovered more than 70 years ago, it was pretty apparent to everyone how weird and strange these organisms were. But following sort of traditional paleontological methods, what most people did was try to take those weird forms and shoehorn them into the forms we're familiar with today. So, broadly circular organisms, they became jellyfish, right? And tubular or elongated organisms, they became worms. And that's how the first paleontology of these fossils was done, was trying to, again, fit them into known classifications of animals today. And then as we started to learn more and find more and more examples of these fossils, it became clear that in many ways these circular fossils are very different from jellyfish. In some cases, they have a stalked organism coming out of those circles and so can't be jellyfish. And learning that that shoehorning of those organisms into those different groups wasn't really working all that way. And so there was kind of a revolution where it was proposed that maybe these early organisms aren't related to things that show up in the Cambrian at all, and that they're this entire failed experiment of animal life that went nowhere, an evolutionary dead end. And so that, I think, really freed us up to think about these organisms independent of modern groups. But as we continue to learn more and more about them, what we're seeing is that this debate about whether they're all animals or whether they're all completely different is like many debates, and the answer lies somewhere in between. And what we're seeing is that yes, some organisms from this time were uniquely adapted to the period and maybe didn't make it out of the Ediacaran time. But there are other examples of things that look a lot like precursors to these shelled and other animals that we find in the Cambrian. And so we have fossils like Kimberella that essentially looks like a snail without its shell, or like a slug. It crawled around maybe with a muscular foot on the seafloor, and it scratched at the organic mat with a frontal appendage that looked something like a radula. And so it's likely that that body plan, that sort of mollusk-like body plan, didn't evolve multiple times, but instead Kimberella is one example of something that survived through the end of the Ediacaran into the Cambrian and gave rise to the group that we call mollusks today. Another organism that we recently described from South Australia is a fossil called Icaria wariutia. And that's really cool because it doesn't look like much. And I'll be the first to admit that. It's this very small organism, about the size of a grain of rice. But what's really important about Icaria is that it left behind these trails. And in order to do that, it must have had a front and a back. It had a direction that it moved. And it looks like it's eating through organic matter and maybe even dead fossils of things like Dickinsonia as it's moving through the sediment. And so that tells us that it probably had an opening to take food in, and an opening to expel waste, and a gut to connect them. And those features, things like a front and a back, they might not seem like a lot, but they unify all animals that we call bilaterians. And so 99% of animals, probably anything you can think of, is a bilaterian. And this fossil, Icaria, looks like the beginnings of bilaterians in the evolutionary progression to the amazing diversity of bilaterians that will appear in the Cambrian and continue to be diverse and abundant today.
People have asked how so many complex animals could have arisen in the Cambrian if the creatures of the preceding Ediacaran had largely gone extinct. Scott, what role could an Ediacaran extinction event have played in the rise of complex animals in the later Cambrian?
So, what we know about evolution is that there are lots of different things that can drive evolutionary change. And so, one of our jobs as paleontologists is try to figure out what actually led to evolutionary change that we see in the fossil record, like that change from these creatures of the Ediacaran to maybe more familiar forms in the Cambrian. And so There's lots of possibilities, but one of the things we know that can lead to evolutionary change is that you can have the extinction of groups of organisms that leads to essentially all of these environments and ecosystems that aren't being fully utilized, and you get the evolution of new forms to fill in that ecospace. And so you can get radiations and diversifications in the wake of an extinction event. And so this is the classic example of this is what happened to the mammals in the wake of the extinction of the dinosaurs. And so you have dinosaurs for millions and millions of years dominating the terrestrial and even marine environments. And they're the large carnivores and herbivores that are walking around on Earth, something we all love to think about. And then we had these catastrophic events, this eruption of a large volcano, as well as the impact of this large meteorite that just completely changed the ecosystem and wiped out all of the dinosaurs. And so then you have all of these niches that are not being filled by certain organisms, and it seems like animals were able to, maybe because of random chance, maybe because of certain features of the mammals themselves, survived this extinction and then radiated in the wake of that extinction of the dinosaurs. And so that's one way you can see major change between groups of organisms in geologic time. And so one possibility is that we're seeing that same thing in the Ediacaran. So some things we've learned about the Ediacaran, again, since it was discovered more than 70 years ago, is that one, this group of weird Precambrian organisms isn't just a singular group, right? We actually see over the about 30 million year period that the actual Ediacaran fossils and the Ediacaran biota themselves existed, that there are changes in diversity and abundance and even the types of organisms that we get at these different times. And so we can start to actually not just go out and look for these fossils, but actually describe changes at different places on Earth and between different times in Earth's past. And so what we're seeing is that there are actually peaks and valleys in diversity in the Ediacaran. And we can start to investigate how that might be linked to changes in the environment. And so we've investigated a couple different ideas that I think are still things that paleontologists are trying to work out. One possibility is that, like the dinosaurs, there was a major environmental change. And one of the things we've learned about environments in the Precambrian is that oxygen seems to have been much less stable than it is today. And we all, as living, breathing animals, know how important oxygen is. And it was probably important to at least some of these Ediacaran animals 550 million years ago. And so it's possible then that changes in the levels of oxygen in the ocean actually led to the extinction of some of these Ediacaran forms. And specifically, we can look at what organisms go extinct and what organisms survive. And we see that maybe the way their bodies were built led to the selective extinction of organisms who would have been better suited to having more oxygen and actually more poorly suited to survive those drops in oxygen levels. Things like Dickinsonia that we talked about, it moved around on the seafloor. That's a behavior that demands a lot of energy. And so you can imagine if oxygen levels drop, that might be really bad for something that wants to move around and needs a lot of energy that it gets from oxygen in the environment. Another possibility is that we start to see at the end of the Ediacaran the advent of organisms, not just like Icaria moving around horizontally on the seafloor, but actually going below the sediment and doing burrowing behaviors. And so it's possible that that too changed the way nutrients were cycled in the Ediacaran Ocean, and also contributed to the loss of these Ediacaran biota that were specifically adapted to the conditions of the time. And so those are two hypotheses that we're still working out. But one thing we do know is at the end of the Ediacaran, there are very few things that survive through that event. And there are only a couple of fossils that we think might be directly related to the kinds we get in the Ediacaran. Of course, we talked about things like Icaria and Kimberella radiating and diversifying into those Cambrian organisms, but it seems pretty apparent that most of the things that were around didn't survive and preserve fossils 10, 20, 30 million years later when we see this radiation of animals in the Cambrian. And so one possibility is that, like the dinosaurs going extinct and giving rise to the mammals, these Ediacaran fossils went extinct for who knows what reason, but ultimately paving the way for the radiation of more familiar animals that we get in the Cambrian.
Earlier this year, 2024, you and your team discovered a new and surprising fossil of an Ediacaran animal you have named Quaestio simpsonorum. So, where was this fossil found and why is it so significant?
Yeah, so we found Quaestio at a site known as Nilpena Ediacaran National Park. That's a site in South Australia, very much in the outback. And it's west of a mountain range known as the Flinders Ranges. And this is very near that place where this Ediacaran period and this Ediacara biota get their names, the Ediacaran Hills. And so that's a site where my graduate advisor, Mary Droser, as well as our colleagues at the South Australian Museum have been working for over 20 years now. And it's really a site of world-class importance for fossils in general and specifically for these early animals. And that's why actually last year it was newly minted, this national park in Australia, and we had a grand opening. So one of the reasons Nilpena is so special and so unique is that it preserves these sandstone layers of rock. And what's cool about that is that each of those sandstone layers actually represents an individual storm event that carried sand into the ocean and buried these Ediacaran fossils as they existed on the seafloor. And so what we do there, which is something that's not done very many places, if anywhere else in the world, is we go in and we systematically peel back each one of those sandstone layers. Fossils are actually best preserved on the bottoms of those layers because of some of the weirdnesses of the geology and the preservation. So we flip them over and we puzzle piece them back together to reconstruct these pieces of the seafloor 550 million years ago. So these can be the size of a classroom, something like 20, 30 square meters in total area. And what's really amazing, and the reason we do all that hard work is because we don't just get beautiful fossils preserved there, but they're preserved with meaningful ecological relationships, right? It's like going out and taking a picture of a shallow marine community today. It's just preserved in the rock record. And so the fact that we can do that at all is amazing. And we can really learn a lot about these organisms, not just by looking at the individuals, but looking at the relationships between them. And one of the things we've learned is that each new layer we peel back reveals a totally different community of these Ediacaran fossils. And so we've now excavated over 30 of these individual beds. And you might think, why do we keep going back? These are the same layers. They're probably within basically the same rock unit. And in many cases, they have a lot of the same fossils. But we keep going back because each layer reveals a different community with different types of organisms living in different associations. And so it's useful for us to keep going back and keep peeling back these layers. And so on one of the most recent layers that we excavated, which we started in 2018, and we actually are still excavating today, we find some really amazing creatures. And that's the reason why we keep going back and getting more of this bed out. And so some of those creatures are creatures that we know, but are actually incredibly large. And so one of the first really cool things that we found on this bedding layer was a Dickinsonia. And so those fossils are usually between 20 and 30 millimeters in total length. The Dickinsonia we found on this new bed was about 50 centimeters in total length. So really exciting find. We're also finding on this bed entirely new taxa that haven't been described from anywhere else in the world. And that's really where Quaestio comes into the picture. So on this bed, we found about 12 fossils of this organism, Quaestio. If you see the reconstruction, it's basically a circle with a question mark in the middle of it. And so if you're ever frustrated looking at a fossil or studying anything, just imagine if that thing had a literal question mark in the middle of it. But we kept finding more and more of these fossils of Quaestio and realized that it was a new thing and that it was distinct from anything else we had seen in the fossil record. Another sort of aha moment with Quaestio was that we had gotten the body fossils, the actual imprints of the organism that was buried alive, right, and left its imprint in the overlying sandstone. But then we also found, in a rare instance, we found behind it this Quaestio-shaped depression in the Ediacaran seafloor. And that tells us that Quaestio actually probably ate organic matter that was sitting out on the seafloor to leave this Quaestio-shaped depression in the mat. And then it actually moved to a new area. And so that tells us that it's one of the first animals to be able to move. Quaestio is actually perhaps most unique in that it has this distinction between left and right side. So that question mark shape that gives its name is not symmetrical between left and right. Right. And so that's something that I think we can maybe all relate to, right? We all know that most of us anyway have a dominant left or right hand, right? That's an asymmetry in our body. We have organs like hearts and appendix that are on different sides of our body, right? That asymmetry is really fundamental to the way we build our bodies, and it's also fundamental to the way a whole diversity of animals have built their bodies over the last 500 million years. And so what's really cool is that we can actually see the beginnings of that left-right asymmetry in this really weird, really old fossil Quaestio from the outback of South Australia.
Scott, I've heard that people are calling this the first animal. Would you agree with that? Is that correct?
Yeah, so unfortunately, it's probably not the first animal. It's one of the first, and it's part of this group that makes the first animal fossils. So the first fossils we can see, but it's actually pretty complex, right? This ability to move, to have a front and a back and a left and a right side, that tells us that actually a lot of evolution has happened since the earliest animals likely to have existed on Earth. And so it's probably not the first animal. It's not even the oldest fossil animal. There are some that are 10, 15 million years older than this. And actually, chemical signatures in the geologic record tell us that animals themselves, this massive group, got their start maybe as much as 100 million years before the Ediacaran. So certainly one of the first animals, and the first animal to move or to have left-right asymmetry, but not necessarily the first animal ever on Earth.
It's incredibly fascinating work that you're doing, Scott, and I'm very grateful that you've been able to come onto the show today to share your discoveries with us. So, what's next for you? Are there any future projects you can tell us about?
Yeah, so we keep going back to Australia, and we're going to actually keep probably excavating that layer of rock that had Quaestio. And some exciting news, actually, there was another new fossil that was on this same layer of rock that is actually it's not quite ready for public release, but it's been accepted and should be out in the next few weeks here. So stay tuned for another new fossil from the outback of South Australia. But we're also looking for these fossils all over the world. So they're soft-bodied. They require really unique conditions to be preserved. And so that means we have to often go to some pretty remote places to study them. And one place I've been going recently is actually in the Yukon and Northwest Territories in northwestern Canada. And so that's really fun because we do things like take helicopters to these mountain ranges in the middle of nowhere. And we're actually finding evidence for these same types of fossils that we get in Australia up there in Northwest Canada. So stay tuned for more on that to come in future years.
Scott Evans, thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to join you at Evolution Soup, and thanks for your interest in our work.